For those people who love history, architecture, brick, and Minnesota, the Northern Pacific shops at Brainerd are for you. The Northern Pacific was a transcontinental railroad across the northern United States, starting near Duluth, Minnesota. The actual starting point was called the Northern Pacific Junction, where the railroad pushed west from the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad. Track layers reached Brainerd, also known as the Crossing, on March 6, 1871. The crossing referred to where a bridge was needed to cross the Mississippi River. The engineers were looking for a place the railroad could cross the river without the need for a drawbridge. The crossing at Brainerd would meet this requirement, allowing steamboats to pass freely under the center span. Once the railroad line was set, lots in Brainerd sold quickly. The Lake Superior and Puget Sound Company, which sold land for the railroad, sold 50 lots in one day. As lots sold, the population quickly rose. By February 1871, the city numbered 500 people. A year later, they had nearly tripled in size. A lot of the initial buildings in Brainerd supported the men working on the railroad. These included general stores, hotels, and saloons. However, compared to the other businesses, saloons greatly outnumbered them all. In addition, there were about 45 houses in town. As the railroad continued to push west from Brainerd, a lot of money was being spent in many different areas. Millions of ties were needed to support the track, as it moved into an area with very few trees. New passenger stations, freight depots, and woodsheds were needed along the route. Lyman Bridges received the contract to design the new passenger depots, which were built exactly the same at every point. Lyman also signed a contract to construct 500 ready-made houses for buyers of Northern Pacific lands along the line. Water tanks and engine houses were needed about every 35 miles along the road. To prevent snow from drifting over the track in the winter, men constructed and installed wooden snow fences along open areas and planted trees for windbreaks. The Northern Pacific shared the railroad line between Northern Pacific Junction and Duluth with the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad. At Duluth, the Northern Pacific needed new docks to land their supplies from ships on Lake Superior. Food, such as eggs, flowed into the Brainerd market from the surrounding country. There was also a huge demand for fresh meat. Most of these products were shipped over the Great Lakes to Duluth and along the recently constructed railroad to Brainerd. In early 1871, the Northern Pacific had 9 locomotives, 130 flat cars, and 20 boxcars. Supplies also flowed northward on the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad from St. Paul and Minneapolis. From the railroad's endpoint at St. Cloud and Sauk Rapids, these supplies were loaded onto wagons to make the last trek to Brainerd. Nearly 100 teams per day traveled this route. In 1871, Joseph Turner drew a map of the town of Brainerd, showing the track of the Northern Pacific through town. His map was the first to detail the Northern Pacific shops, just to the east of town. However, as we will show later, the orientation of the buildings wasn't quite correct. Lyman Bridges, who had secured several Northern Pacific contracts, and James H. Place of St. Cloud were the architects of the original Northern Pacific shops. Bridges, who had served in the Civil War, came west from Chicago. Andrew Cruikshank, also from Chicago, was the builder of the machine shops. Cruikshank would later become chief of construction for the railroad. Dan Childs and Sam McQuaid from Duluth built the original Brainerd roundhouse. McQuaid was part of the Duluth Manufacturing Company, who also had various Northern Pacific contracts. The brick for the original smokestack at the Brainerd Northern Pacific shops likely came from local sources. The Northern Pacific Manufacturing Company at Brainerd burned decent quantities of brick in the summer of 1872. The company claimed its brick were A number 1 and could supply the great demand for brick in the area. Calls then went out for men to help with the construction of the shops. The first roundhouse contained 12 stalls and was built of wood. The machine shop was a huge building for its time, 240 by 65 feet. An office building was built just south of the machine shop, also of wood. A 60 by 60 foot blacksmith shop was built on the southeast side of the machine shop. And finally, a brick smokestack, inscribed 1872, was built to the east of the machine shop and just north of the blacksmith shop. A passenger depot and office building were built in the town of Brainerd in 1872 and was considered an architectural ornament to the town. James H. Place was the architect of the new depot, which was located in the central portion of town. The depot was built just north of the main line of the Northern Pacific and was 40 by 80 feet, 2 stories high, with an attic. The most prominent feature was a 60-foot tall tower over the front entrance. The first floor had separate men's and women's waiting rooms, a ticket and telegraph office, and washrooms and closets. The second floor held various Northern Pacific offices, and also washrooms and closets. The attic was covered by a mansard roof and had dormer windows for light. In 1872, the railroad built a colonist reception house to accommodate settlers coming to the area to buy railroad land. A small hospital building was also built nearby. Settlers could stay at the house as they looked for a parcel of land to buy. This house was located on the west bank of the Mississippi River. Finally, in 1872, the railroad built a waterworks across the Mississippi River near their railroad bridge. This allowed the railroad to pump the water that was needed for all their buildings from the river. This waterworks was located on the eastern edge of the river. From February 1872 to February 1873, the population of Brainerd doubled again. As the town grew, the number of buildings also increased, especially the number of hotels and stores. With its permanence established, manufacturing companies, a newspaper, churches, and other shops were constructed. In 1874, the Northern Pacific built a park in the space between the railroad track and Front Street. Mike Smith and his son Dennis of the Northern Pacific Nursery laid out the park. The red rectangle shows the park's location, which was inside a fenced area. This drawing appears to show the fence and trees of the park. A new drawing of the town of Brainerd came out in 1875 by J.T. Halstead. Included were drawings of the Cass County Courthouse in Brainerd and an image of the Northern Pacific machine shops and office. F.J. Haynes was the official photographer of the Northern Pacific Railroad. As a result, he was supplied with his own rail car. Haynes was based for a while in Moorhead, Minnesota, but in 1877 he took a series of stereoscopic views of Brainerd. One of these views was of the roundhouse and shops, which provided a great view of the complex. The machine shops and office matched the 1875 Halstead drawing perfectly. The view was taken from the southwest, looking at the complex to the northeast. Another Haynes view is image 133 of the Brainerd series. This view is just like the prior one, taken from the southwest, looking northeast. Again, this gave a good idea of the shop's complex. View 134 of the Brainerd series was looking at the complex from the east. This showed the brick smokestack and several of the other wooden buildings. This image was taken from a point right along the main line Northern Pacific tracks. Another Haynes view featured the office building. It also included a locomotive and several men standing in the doorway. This view was taken along the main line tracks, looking to the northeast. By 1880, the Northern Pacific shops employed nearly 200 men. However, by 1881, the number doubled and then some. This graphic shows the various departments the men worked in, with carpentry employing the largest number. A fire burned down the blacksmith shop in 1881, while several other nearby buildings were luckily saved. After worrying the railroad would rebuild elsewhere, the townspeople learned that the railroad would stay in Brainerd, and it would rebuild with new fireproof buildings. The architect selected for the job was Frederick Gilbert of the Northern Pacific Railroad in Brainerd. The new shops were to be constructed of brick and iron, so they were nearly fireproof. Gilbert had just been selected as engineer in charge of shop construction at Brainerd. The railroad rejected all the bids on the new buildings and decided to build the complex themselves. The brick were made locally in Brainerd at the Schwartz Brickyard, which had been established in 1878. A spur track to the brickyard was built in 1881, so the brick could be easily transported to the new shop complex. The foundations for the new complex were made of granite, which likely came from Watauga, Minnesota, near St. Cloud. At the quarry, the company was also mining stone for the piers of their bridge across the Missouri River at Bismarck, North Dakota. The Northern Pacific had built a rail line along the eastern side of the Mississippi River from Brainerd to the Watauga and Sauk Rapids areas. The company had leased a quarry just to the east of Watauga, where a branch line had been constructed. So again, the granite could easily be transported back to Brainerd. The iron used in the new Brainerd shops came from Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Cornice Works also provided the slate for the roofs of the new buildings. There were slate mines along the Northern Pacific Railroad southwest of Duluth. However, it is unsure if the slate actually came from there. To finish the Brainerd shops, it took 36 carloads of slate, 6 carloads of roofing felt, 1 carload of glass for lights, and 2 carloads of galvanized iron. Once the contracts were let, men were again wanted to help finish the job. This is a view of the Northern Pacific shops from the Northwest magazine. The new shops were all constructed south of the main line of the railroad. The shops included a roundhouse for 44 locomotives, 316 feet in diameter. I believe this sketch of a locomotive being repaired showed the inside of this roundhouse. It also included a locomotive shop 80 by 175 feet for tank repair, copper, and boiler shops. A transfer table that could move a locomotive into any part of the adjoining shops. A machine shop 120 by 250 feet for machinery and engines. An office and storage building 44 by 280 feet with a 65-foot high clock tower. A blacksmith shop 80 by 195 feet in size. a powerhouse and smokestack, which made steam for the machinery and heat for all the buildings. An oil house that held thousands of gallons of oil, and a foundry complex 200 by 80 feet. This sketch shows the new foundry buildings in greater detail. Here is a sketch of the new shops from the southwest looking northeast. In 1883, the old colonist reception house burned down. The building had been turned into a hospital for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Cass Gilbert, who would later design the Minnesota Capitol building, was selected as the architect for the new hospital. The hospital complex was located on the west side of the Mississippi River and included homes for the chief surgeon and nurses. The main building was fancy, containing 3 turrets on its south side. Another map of Brainerd was drawn in 1883 by the Hines brothers. This may have been the first map to feature an intricate layout of the Northern Pacific Shops complex. When comparing this 1883 shops map to the one drawn back in 1871, the layout doesn't match. However, the 1883 drawing does match the 1875 drawing of the machine shops and office building, shown by the blue and yellow colors. The Northwest Magazine did a story on Brainerd in March 1883. Inside, it included drawings of the Brainerd Bridge with a train crossing, about to pass the hospital building. The Episcopal Church, located near the town square, and a view looking west at the main business district. At one point in November 1883, 80 locomotives were at the shops in Brainerd. The Northwest Magazine did another story on Brainerd in their June 1885 issue. The Northern Pacific Railroad lent a caboose to the men from the magazine to use as their quarters for a trip along the railroad line. The men loved the old red caboose. On hot days, they could open all the doors for a fresh breeze. An artist again sketched several new views of Brainerd, including this one, looking at the passenger depot and Villard House. A slightly better look at the Villard House, the Opera House, the Commercial Hotel, First National Bank Building, the Howe and Company Lumber Mill, Howe and Douglas Flour Mill, City High School building, and a view of the courthouse. Fire again struck the Northern Pacific Shops complex in 1886 in a much larger way. Nearly all the original shop buildings, constructed in 1871 and 2, burned down, including a number of freight cars and coaches, machinery, and other stock. These buildings were all located north of the main line track. Again, the Northern Pacific decided to rebuild at Brainerd, with John L. Bjorkquist being the main builder. As local brick were unavailable, brick were transported from Moorhead, Minnesota, which was also along its main line. The foundations again were granite from the quarries at Watab. This Sanborn map from 1892 shows the entire Northern Pacific complex. Most of the buildings were now constructed of brick, shown by pink colors, with very few wooden buildings left. Bjorkquist constructed the group of buildings shown in red. A picture of this new group of buildings was taken from the west, looking to the east. These buildings matched the fancy brickwork done on the 1881 and 1882 buildings. In 1888, the Northwest Magazine did a feature story on Brainerd, calling it the City of Pines. This story featured a number of new sketches of the Brainerd area, including Gilbert Lake, north of Brainerd, Rice Lake, the Mississippi River Dam, the railroad bridge across the Mississippi River, the sanitarium, and the Howe lumber mill. In the town of Brainerd itself, there were sketches of the courthouse, YMCA building, the Kindred Block, Episcopal Church, the Sleeper Home, Congregational Church, Sleeper Opera House, the Sleeper Block, and the pumping station and electric powerhouse. There was also a view of Front Street, a spectacular panoramic of the city from the top of the courthouse, this being the first segment, and this the second. And a view of 6th Street. (1893) brought a new addition to the Brainerd shops, and Andrew Tollefson was selected as the builder. Tollefson was from Minneapolis. Brick for the new job were purchased from Little Falls, Minnesota. The new car shop was built just north of the main line tracks. This view shows the car shop's building from the west, looking east. This is a view of the entire complex from the east, looking west. More additions came to the Brainerd complex in 1900, with the Butler Ryan Company of St. Paul selected for the job. Once again, Little Falls brick were purchased for the outer walls of the buildings. However, rather than granite, the foundations were made of concrete. The steel for the new shops came from the American Bridge Company of Chicago. The 1900 additions included an eastern extension to the blacksmith shop, a doubling in size of the machine shop, a doubling in size of the boiler shop, a new car shop, and a transfer table between the two car shops. Several views of the new shops were taken from the southwest, looking northeast. The doubled size of the machine shop and boiler shop is quite evident, as both new buildings were also taller. This photo shows the oil house on the left side and the smokestacks from the northern power plant exhausting dark smoke. By 1901, there were fewer men working in the carpentry shops, with the majority now employed in the machine and locomotive shops. The grand total of men working in the complex totaled 565. A tie treating plant was added in the Brainerd area in 1907. This plant was located on the west side of the Mississippi River, near the Northern Pacific Hospital. Treating ties in creosote prolonged their lifespan. Here are several views of the tie plant. The Northern Pacific made more additions to its complex in 1907, selecting Libby and Nelson as the builders. Rather than slate, this time the company selected steel for the roofs. This 1907 Sanborn map shows the new additions well. There were 2 additions to the blacksmith shop, one on the east side and one on the south side. There was also an addition to the brick storehouse, an office building. 3 years later, in 1910, William Hoy of St. Paul was selected to make further additions to the Northern Pacific shops. These additions can be seen on the 1913 Sanborn map. A large foundry building was added on the east side of the complex, with a pattern storage building just to its south. This is a photo of the two buildings, taken from the southeast, looking northwest. This is a more recent photo of the pattern storage building, from the southwest, looking northeast. Finally, this is a drawing of the shop's complex from 1914. The Northern Pacific built a new passenger depot that was completed in 1920. This was built by McManus and Tarnowski of St. Paul. This was an updated brick building to replace the original depot built back in 1872. In 1924, Charles Skoglund of St. Paul was hired to build another addition to the shop's complex. Skoglund's company built a large power plant, two 200-foot-tall smokestacks, and a coal hopper. This power plant would furnish steam heat for all the shops. The new power plant was located just to the east of the roundhouse and blacksmith shops, and is shown in this photo from 1946. This aerial photo showed the Northern Pacific shops in 1939. This is a set of blueprints for the shop's complex, dated 1942. These show great detail on each of the buildings, like this one of the roundhouse. Here's a Google Earth image of the site in 2008. The railroad only uses the buildings north of the main line now. The buildings to the south have been sold. Finally, this is a Google Earth image of the site from 2023. There is a lot of history associated with the Brainerd shops, thus most of the remaining buildings have been designated as historically significant. Many of these buildings are being converted for reuse. The site is definitely worth a visit. That concludes the video. Make sure to check out my other YouTube videos and my primary website at mnbricks.com.